excited to be introducing our Rutledge Memorial Lecturer, Dr. Jackie Murray from the University of Kentucky. Before I introduce Dr. Murray, though, I'd like to say a little bit about the Rutledge Memorial Lecture Fund. This fund was established in 1984 by Harry Rutledge in honor of his parents. Dr. Rutledge came to UT in 1968 as head of the Department of Classics and chair of the Comparative Literature program. He was head of classics for 23 years until 1991, and he retired in 1996. He was also simultaneously head of the Department of Romance Languages from 1972 to 77. He was named Mace Bearer of the university in 1992. Statewide, he was founder and president of the Tennessee Classical Association and a charter member of the Tennessee Foreign Language Teachers Association. Regionally, he served as president of the Classical Association of Middle West and South and received an awatio for his outstanding service. He also was president of the Southern Comparative Literature Association. Nationally, he served as president of the American Classical League and won Emeritus Award for his work. Internationally, he was president of the Virgilian Society. Most of all, he was a beloved and popular teacher at the university. When he passed away, we added him as an honoree to the fund. His generosity has allowed us to invite preeminent classic scholars to our campus every year. So we are very grateful for that fund. This year, we have invited to campus Dr. Jackie Murray. She's an associate professor of classics in the Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures and Cultures Department of the University of Kentucky. We are very pleased to have her back for a second visit, hopefully not the last. She received her PhD in classics from the University of Washington and her MA in classics from the University of Western Ontario. She's on the editorial board of 3 academic publications, and her primary research area is Hellenistic poetry, its reception of archaic Greek poetry, and its influence on Latin and Imperial Greek literature. She has published several important articles on this topic. Her 2014 article, Anchored in Time, The Date in Apollonius's Argonautica, used astronomy to finally give a historical context to this, to the Argonautica, to this poem. Most recently, she published Quarreling with Callimachus in the IWM special volume in honor of Annette Harder. And she has forthcoming an article on the authentic female voice in male-oriented Hellenistic poetry entitled Poetically Erect Again, which I'm very excited to read. And her second area of interest, which she's going to speak to us about tonight, is on race in the classics, especially the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. And if you attended our Haynes Morris lecture in 2020, you will, like me, be very excited, excitedly waiting for the textbook that she is co-writing with Dr. Futo Kennedy, entitled Understanding Race and Ethnicity in Greco-Roman Antiquity. Dr. Murray is also co-writing an anti-racist teaching guide with Shelley Haley and Kelly Dugan. And the paper she's presenting today is part of a larger study of racecraft and anti-racist voices in Greek and Roman epic. An article based on this preliminary research is forthcoming in an edited volume entitled Bloomsbury Cultural History of Race Series, and the article is entitled Race and Sexuality, Racecraft in the Odyssey. Dr. Murray has been honored with several awards, but the 2 most recent that I just want to highlight is the College of Arts and Sciences at UK has awarded her the Diversity Award this year. And last year, she was granted the fellowship at the Center for Hellenic Studies. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Murray.
Well, thank you. I can't even hear any. The webinar format is hilarious. Well, thank you, Jessica, for that nice introduction. It's always great to hang out in the vicinity, even if it's only virtually. But yeah, so we'll have to do an exchange of Bourbon Trail / Dollywood and whatnot in the future. And of course, then the Pantheon. We have to go to the Pantheon at some point. All right. Well, so I'm happy to share this ongoing project with you all. So it's as Jessica pointed out, Professor Westerholt pointed out, this discussion is part of a larger study of race in ancient Greek and Roman epics. So it started off. I thought I could talk about all epics. Yeah. Well, we got stuck on the Odyssey. But today I'm actually going to talk about. I'm going to try to bring in the Iliad this time as well. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. And so let's just go forward. Oops, doesn't do that. All right. So I'm going to start by establishing a way of dealing with race in a transhistorical context. As many of you are probably aware, the way we talk about race and the way we think about race does not map on completely onto the way the ancient Greeks, Romans, or even just if we went across the Atlantic, even to England or China or something like that, they don't talk about race necessarily in the same way that we do. We tend to privilege phenotypic and skin color, phenotypic features, and how race is constructed, whereas in the ancient world, that might not have been as salient depending on the context, time period, etc. So one of the things I'm going to talk about in the first section is a transhistorical description of race that we can use to uncover what race looked like in antiquity, and then specifically, of course, I'm going to be looking at what race might look like in epic. And then, so in the second section, then we're going to be looking at how can you recognize race, and then looking at it in the Odyssey, Argonautica, and in the Iliad. And in particular, I want to be talking about how these authoritative storytelling media are actually participating in the construction of race, in particular, laying some of the sort of ideas down for race. And so there's a racialized hierarchy in the mythical world that can then be recruited in the real world to sort of support existing hierarchy in the polis, or even in our time, depending on when it's being recruited. So first, I'm going to look at what it looks like in these epics. And then the question is, can we find anti-racist voices? And what would they look like? And so that will be the last section. And so, okay, so when we're discussing a transhistorical definition of race, we have to start from where we are with a clear depiction of what race looks like now. And I'm going to actually or summarize a story, read a little bit about it, summarize a story out of, can you guys see that? Lillian Smith's Killers of the Dream, mainly because, of course, we're in the Appalachia setup, virtually in Appalachia. And she's actually a figure from the civil rights movement that was connected to the region. All right. And so, but I think her story is going to illustrate for us a kind of an aspect of race that A, we will recognize, and B, we can see why it could be transhistorical. So she recounts in the first chapter of Killers of the Dream, which she published in 1944, quote, "A little girl was found in the colored section of our town. Living with a little white girl, sorry. A little white girl was found in the colored section of our town, living with a Negro family in a broken down shack. This family had moved in a few weeks before and little was known of them, unquote. Now, since the child was, quote unquote, very white, indeed, it was generally assumed that the child had been kidnapped. And after harassing the Black family, who were then who refused to talk about the origin of the child, the white townsfolk, particularly the women of the town, escorted by the marshal, took the child from her putative adopted Black family, despite their crying and protestations. She was then brought to our home, quote, this is now Lillian speaking again. She was then brought to our home, and I don't know why my mother, why my mother consented to this plan. Perhaps she loved children and always showed concern for them. So Janie, the little girl, roomed with Lillian, who became close to her, sharing her clothes and dolls. The two children played together morning and night. But then it was eventually discovered that Janie really did belong with the Negro family. Lillian writes, in a little while, my mother called my sister and me into our bedroom and told us that in the morning, Janie would have to return to Colored Town. Lillian asked her mother, well, why does Janie have to leave? And her mother said, quote, because Janie is a little colored girl. And Lillian protested, but she's white. Uh, we were mistaken. She's colored. But she's colored. Please don't argue. What does that mean? Lillian whispered. It means, her mother said, that she has to live in the colored town with colored people. Lillian persisted with why and I don't understand. And her mother finally shut down further discussion with you're too young to understand. So nevertheless, it was left up to Lillian to explain to Janie why she had to leave. And Lillian observes that for the first time in her life, she realized that there was some mighty force out there that compelled everyone to change the way they treated Janie. She felt compelled to believe they were right. Quote, it was the only way my world could be held together, and slowly it began to seep through me. I was white and she was colored, and we must not be together. It was bad to be together, though we eat with our nurse when we're little. It was bad to eat with any colored person after that. It was bad, just as other things were bad that your mother had told you. So it was bad that she was to sleep in the room with me that night. It was bad. So as Lillian grew older and had more experiences like this, she began to know that, quote, people who talked of love and children didn't mean it. She also knew that something was wrong with the world that tells, actually, I should move along here. There's Lillian, sorry. This is the quote I want to have. So something was wrong with a world that tells you that love is good and people are important, and then forces you to deny love and humiliate people. Smith ends the chapter with her memory of a Negro woman saying to her quietly, quote, we can't ride together on the bus. Oh, you know, it's not legal to be human down here. Okay, so begin with that story because the issue here is our notions about skin color, right, are not in play here. Both girls are white looking, right? So just want to, but yet nevertheless, what is going on is, of course, race, right? And Du Bois, who I've been working on teaching this semester, of course, is famous for his the identification of the construction of race by social forces, right? So the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, he points out, right? And by that, he's talking about the ways in which race is constructed socially. So we'll note that based on what Janie looked like, Lillian Smith's Janie was white, right? She was very white indeed, as they said. And it was only after the white folk in town discovered the secret of her birth, i.e., that she had black blood, she became colored, a different race. Um, so this brings up to the widely held misconception is exposed by this story, that this belief that race is real, like the sort of physical characteristics of race are real, and that it's the awareness of physical difference that causes racism. This view is overturned by this, because there is no quote unquote physical difference. Acknowledging physical differences, for example, skin tones or phenotypical features, but not acknowledging race. Nor does it make one racist. Moreover, race doesn't require physical difference to be a criterion here. And so let's get into some definitions then. Rather, what determines race is the ism, the ideology, racism. That is, it's the ideology that legitimates the desire or the need or the motive of a group with power in society or in the world to impose their collective will on to oppress, to exploit, to conquer, and even to exterminate other groups in their interests. So racism determines the criteria for racial categories, the direction of the oppression, the systems that police the boundaries of these categories, and maintain the hierarchy. So race can't exist apart from racism, because it's racism that invents the races. Like it's the ideology that invents the races, endowing them with these endowing races with irreprehensible, invisible essences, so the black blood in the case of Janie here, in order to naturalize the power structure and justify the actions of the dominant group. And so the well here, so this I sort of adapted from Professor Futo Kennedy's last lecture. I sat in on her lecture, where she actually went through a sort of processing. And so, yeah, I thought it might be good to do that too. So first you have the motive of, the motive to oppress, exploit, conquer, control, exterminate this other group. Maybe you want their land, maybe you want their labor, whatever it is, that motive is first. And then racism, the story, the ideology that justifies that exploitation is subsequent. And there are various mechanisms that are going to reinforce that. There's soft power mechanisms, which is what the one that I'm going to focus on, which are storytelling, art, monuments, etc., things that aren't overtly violent, right? Then you have institutional mechanisms like law, religion, education, various institutional setups that reinforce race. And then, of course, there's the violence, the police, the militarism, mob violence, terrorism, brutality, cruelty, things manifesting in lynchings, shooting people, etc. Right? So you have a range of mechanisms that coalesce to reinforce the categories and police those boundaries of the categories that are established by race, by the racist ideology. And so how is race socially constructed, right? How races are socially constructed are by these various operations that produce double standards in the law. So the laws don't apply equally to people of different races. The ways in which people are depicted are not equal. Various ways in which double standards are applied. And I'm going to go through quite a few of them here. And the point of it, though, is to maintain the hierarchy, right? That you want to maintain. It's always a hierarchical relationship. there was a powerful person, group, etc., opposing their power on the other. So there's oppression is always required when we're talking about race. And so let's get here. So to get back to the socially constructed definition of race, how do you know someone is a Black person? Well, they have to ride the Jim Crow car in Georgia, or they have to live in Colored Town, as in the case of Janie, right? Doesn't look Black, she's Black. She has to live in Colored Town. So this gets to this, how I see race working on another aspect of it, in addition to the power and oppression that's required. You also have to have, I think for race, you also have to have the idea of humanity being withheld or threatening, or being threatened. So the dominant group, so racialization is constructed from the perspective of the dominant group, right? So the dominant group determines which other groups within the society or other groups in the world are like itself, right? And so, and other groups are not like themselves. So the groups that they think that are completely alien to them, they withhold humanity from them. So they're treated as having alienated humanity. They persistently refuse to grant humanity to the racialized group, and this manifests itself in the various ways they're treated vis-a-vis the laws, vis-a-vis all these cultural mechanisms, right? But then also it's important to notice that other groups, in order to maintain the dynamic, other groups are also shoved along this, what I call this continuum here. They are either goaded in or enticed into assimilation. So because their humanity can be alienated from them. It isn't, but it can be, right? And so if we don't toe the line, then we will be treated like the other group, which is used as a sort of warning to this group. And we can see groups being, today we can see groups being moved along this line from being a group that the dominant group sees as like itself to being racialized. Right? We can just think of Arab Americans who are identified as white and therefore should be, in the dominant group, but thanks to 9/11, et cetera, and all the last president's rhetoric, are moved into the racialized group, right? They're starting to be treated like they're a race, right? So people can move along. So it's not so you're the only group that seems to maintain its humanity, because they have an inalienable humanity from their perspective, is the dominant group. Others are in this sort of flux. They can move in and out. However, once you get into the racialized group, it's hard to move out of that, to move back into assimilation. And this is, I think, is what Du Bois is talking about when he says that the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line, because Black people cannot get out of this alienated humanity position. We can't seem to get white folk to see Black folks as having the same inalienable humanity as white folk. So that's the issue. All right, so let's keep going. And so on the individual level then, people engage in racism when they can weaponize the dominant group's position vis-a-vis the dominated group, right? And you don't have to be white. You don't have to be a white male. You can be a Black woman and weaponize the racist structures against another Black body. But Amy Cooper is a great example of an individual who's tapping into the racist system and is able to then threaten the the life of someone in the dominated group, right? Okay. And so then this brings me to an important concept that I'm now sort of trying to incorporate into my work about this, which is this idea of necropolitics that Achille Memembe talks about in his sort of tweaking of Foucault. And the idea here is that what's at stake in the state violence is the right to kill, or to which body, to determine which bodies live and which bodies will die. And this is Foucault's idea of biopower. However, when we start thinking about it in terms of in a racialized state, then the racism functions as a manifestation of the state's necropolitics in determining who can be killed without consequence and who can be who cannot be killed or who should not be killed, right? And so I'll go to the next slide here. All right. And so and another point I wanted to get, because this is actually an aspect of the discussion I'm going to have, is workers being racialized, work itself being racialized. So this is easy to see, I think, in the ancient world, because we are talking about cultures that have slavery, and slavery is already a dehumanizing, humanity alienating process, right? And so workers are racialized in the ancient world. As, certain workers are racialized in that their humanity is withheld, in that they're treated as fungible, they're treated as commodities that can be bought and sold. Their recognition of their family or their human characteristics, their needs for love and comfort, et cetera, all of this stuff is not granted to certain workers in the ancient world. And in particular, we're going to look at the slave girls, slave women who get enslaved, and herders in the Odyssey. But yeah, okay. So I'm going to move on now to, let's look at some examples from Epic. And so the Odyssey, I'm arguing, establishes for, like, so there's two ways to look at race. We can look at race in its horrific, atrocity level, where we're talking about war, which is why we're going to look at the Iliad in a second. Or we can talk about race in peacetime, in the everyday, ordinary, run-of-the-mill race. And the Odyssey actually gives us this. So it establishes this a racial relationship, I argue, between herders and heroes as an important feature of the epic world. And subsequent poets like Apollonius and others, Virgil, etc., actually accept this feature as a given aspect of the mythical world. And in the Odyssey, we'll see herders are alienated from their humanity by the double standards that operate in the epic world, and by their association with the monstrous herders of the mythical world, that is the Cyclopes and the Laestrygonians. And although they are not part of Odysseus's real world, that is the Laestrygonians and the Cyclopes aren't really part of the real world, Odysseus's real world, they operate then but as monstrified proxies for herders who are. And I think it's important to remember that Odysseus is the king. He is the government. He is the state of his world. When he gets back to Ithaca, he's going to be the state. And so how he casts the Cyclopes and the Laestrygonians actually reflects the state's construction of herders. So, and this gets us into thinking about, well, what is racecraft? right? So racecraft then is going to be the storytelling or the art or whatever. It's going to be the way in which we make the race seem natural, make way we convince people that this is the way the world is, right? And so this is Barbara and Karen Fields, who talk about it, racecraft as this collective alchemy by which reason converts bald-faced inventions into external constraining facts of nature capable of resisting individual doubt. And again, we can go back to the story about Janie, where they've invented a race for her, right? The society has invented a race for her and she is forced into it because of, well, the story. Well, Black people and white people shouldn't be in the same, sleep in the same room, etc. This kind of thing. So races then aren't given; they are they're created, right, by the need to create these hierarchies, etc. And then, but it's racecraft that makes us believe that they are given in nature, right? So that's why the tendency to think about races as a real thing is coming because of all the racecraft that we're exposed to. And so a good example that they give is, well, the peasants didn't fall under the dominion of the nobility by virtue of being perceived as innately inferior, right? No, on the contrary, they came to be perceived as innately inferior by virtue of coming under the domination of the nobility, right? The fact that you get dominated and then you're perceived to be inferior, not, but then it's flipped back to say, oh, well, the reason why you were dominated was because you were inferior. So there's this a logic here that racecraft tends to operate with. Okay, so let's get to the Odyssey then. So I have like a simple formula for how to recognize race in especially in the ordinary everyday operations in the Odyssey, which is you need a way to consider the group as not human or to withhold humanity from them, and that poetic process, I argue, is monstrification. So that is the association with the monsters in the story. And then that's one thing. That's why they have different. They're considered have this imagined essence, this different essence through their metaphorical association with monsters. And then they have then they live out this race through the way they experience the double standards of the society, right? And so then these double standards are then operating on their bodies. So they're given less food, they're in death, they're treated differently, right? So this is how the double standards work. All right. And so really quickly, Du Bois in Darkwater talks about this, how the reason why there's so much hatred generated against Black people through racism is because of this persistent stereotyping of Blacks, constantly degrading Blacks to convince even, honest, ordinary, modern men in the belief that Black folk are subhuman. A mass of despicable men, inhuman, at best laughable, at worst meat for mobs and fury. And bearing in mind that he's writing this at the height of Jim Crow, with lynchings at their height, etc., right, to reinforce the racial boundary. So, all right, okay, and so here's an example. This is taken from Stony the Road by Lewis Gates Jr., Henry Louis Gates Jr., where all these images starting from representations or reflections on Aesop's fable all the way through to the various soap ads, all reinforcing, this is in the artistic realm, soft power artistic realm, where constantly being bombarded with images of Black skin being a monstrosity, right? And that's so this is of course reinforcing the idea that Black people are not human or not fully human, or etc. All right. So, okay, let's go to the Odyssey then. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus, remember, we get the story of the Cyclops from Odysseus, and that's really important. He is the one, and that's why I wanted to mention the fact that he is the state ultimately, because he's going to be a king, and kings tend to be the state. But he is the one that's constructing our picture of the Odyssey, of the Cyclopes. He's telling it to the Phaeacians, who already have an attitude toward the Cyclopes. And so Odysseus tells the stories to the Phaeacians about his encounters with the Cyclops and like Strygonians, in order to maintain the racial continuum that he's creating by the narrative, where he is similar to them. So a lot of analysis show how the Phaeacians are kind of like heroes, whereas the Cyclopes are the opposite, right? They live in the opposite universe. And so the attitudes of Odysseus's listeners then are sort of, that is, the internal listeners are predisposed to enjoy the story. The Phaeacians are predisposed to enjoy the story because, just like Odysseus, they are city-dwelling people, and their ancestors were harassed and driven out of their homeland by the Cyclopes. And so they get pleasure from this story, from Odysseus, because they can get a vicarious revenge through his treatment of the biggest of the Cyclopses, Polyphemus. So in this way, then, while the stories Odysseus tells constructs these herders, like, because the Cyclopes are herders, as a race within the discourse of ethnography, so that we use, there's a lot of Odysseus talking about ethnographic, proto-ethnographic stuff, and putting some of that here. This proto-ethnography transmogrifies the alienated humanity of the Cyclopes into this terrifying alien monstrosity. And then the Phaeacians' approbation of the story encourages the poem's primary audience to align with this view. So we focalize the story through the Phaeacians, who enjoy the story, and we're swept away by the magic of the story to be on against the Cyclopes and for the Phaeacians. And okay, and what's interesting too is Odysseus, he wants to be superior. He wants to humiliate the Cyclops. That's another aspect of who he is. So he can't be okay with just blinding the Cyclops and getting out of the cave, as we all know. But he has to turn around and say, nobody prevents Polyphemus from getting, etc. And then he has to turn around later and tell him who he is, right? And in this, it's important that he wants to humiliate the Cyclops. That's really part of the aspect of the story. And so he glories in his ability to do that because he thinks he's going to get away with this scot-free, right? Because this is the attitude of heroes. The heroes think that they have a right to do whatever they want to do to other bodies, the bodies of the racialized group, right? And so in this case, he blinded him, which of course is a hubristic act. It's an act of making someone less than human, and he's able to, and he's glorifying that. And so we'll come back to that later. All right, so here are some of the social ways in which the race is going to be constructed. So we have monsterification, which I've just been talking about, where we're claiming that the other race has something about them, whether it's real in the sense that whether they actually do look different or not, but there's something monstrous about them. And then we reinforce that with various double standard situations. And in the ordinary running of the mill things, these can manifest in sumptuary codes, that is, double standards about what kinds of material goods and comforts go with what kinds of people, right? So who gets to wear what particular clothing, who gets to eat what kind of food, that kind of stuff. Another important way in which this is maintained in the ordinary realm is kinship restrictions, and this has to do with who can marry whom, right? Certain groups are not allowed to marry each other, right? And so basically preventing bonds of marriage among different groups. That's another aspect. And then let's see the third one. Yeah, as centering is another one where the whole experience of the racial dynamic is always focalized and centered from the dominant group's perspective. And so this is going to be the case, of course, in the epic, since the epic centers the hero. We can't really get around that aspect of it. And then ritual deference is another aspect of the ordinary, which is no matter what the circumstances are, the dominant group insists upon deference from the dominated group, no matter what. And we'll look at that. And then sexual asymmetry is another one that I talk about in the article, where this is different from kinship restrictions, in that kinship restrictions is about who can marry whom. Sexual asymmetry is about whose body is available sexually to whose. So if you're in the dominant group, all bodies that are in the racialized group are available to you sexually. So it's not just about female bodies, also male bodies are available as well. But the other way doesn't work. The racialized group does not have legitimate access to any other bodies. In fact, their sexual activity tends to be policed by the dominant group. All right. Okay, so the racecraft of the Odyssey sustains, justifies, and naturalizes this mythical herder hierarchy. So let's just go through a little bit about that. So in the case of when we get to Ithaca, we start to see some of this manifest itself in the way in which Odysseus interacts with Eumaeus. And so we get the sumptuary codes come in, where Eumaeus points out that all of the herders have just one outfit, right? And in fact, we hear about Eumaeus gets his outfit way back when he was a kid, and Odysseus's mother had sent him out into the fields, and so he's got one outfit. Whereas, of course, a hero would have many outfits. So part of the issue with Eumaeus, I think one way of reading the issue with Eumaeus and Odysseus over the cloak is that as Odysseus starts telling his stories about who he is in his fictitious identity, it becomes clear to Eumaeus that Odysseus is a down and out hero. He's not a potential herder. He's not he's not of their race, right? And so he eventually advises him, well, why don't you wait till Telemachus comes, because he'll be able to give you nice clothes, not just a cloak that I'm giving you, but he'll be able to give you nice clothes because you can wear nice clothes, right? The kinship restrictions, though, is really interesting how that's subtly presented in the Odyssey, because you're told that Eumaeus grew up with Timene, Odysseus's sister, right? And that in fact he was bought as a baby to be her companion, right? But then when they got to be they started to grow up, right? And it's as I grew up with her and I was held in a bit lower esteem. He notices that he's not being treated the same. And when we both reached the prime of youth, in its that is full of desire, then they gave her away in marriage to a Samian and got many gifts, right? So she was married off to someone of her own race. And what happened to him? Well, he was sent back to the fields, or sent into the fields for the first time. And he seems to think, though, that Odysseus's mom, she loved me in her heart, right? Whether that's thing. So through the fog of Eumaeus's fond feelings, it's evident that he's never really considered part of Odysseus's family, right? Even though way he describes her suggests that maybe he had some kind of feelings for Timene, he's not willing to express them in any way that could be dangerous, right? But the way he uses words like tanu peplos, which is usually used of heroines, iphthime, again another adjective used for heroes and heroines. He and with erotic charge, there's a sense that he may have had feelings for her, but they're not supposed to be possible. And in fact, he was just brought up as a playmate. He's just that's his thing. Now, in terms of centering, as I said, the Odyssey is going to center Odysseus. But what's interesting is how even Eumaeus is made to center Odysseus. Whenever he complains about the suitors misbehaving or whatever, it's sort of never really underscored that if Odysseus was in charge, it would be very similar. Right? Only that the part of the problem with the suitors is that there's a lot of them. There's 100 and something of them. So of course they're overwhelming everyone with their demands, but they are of the same race as Odysseus. They're heroes. And so, or the hero's sons. And so they are supposed to get the good food and they are supposed to get all these things. The part of the problem is, of course, they're overstaying their welcome. But in terms of what they have rights to, yeah, they could be, they should be eating all this stuff. Um, uh, and so he doesn't challenge that as much as he challenges, he thinks that he doesn't point out the fact that, well, it's really the overwhelmingness that of their desires and not to do with, not just that they're bad. He's claiming that they're bad people when in fact, these demands for the best food and everything to go to the table of Odysseus would be the same. So that's not the issue. So, and then he says, strangers and beggars are all from Zeus, but friendly is our generosity, because this is the custom of slaves, always dreading when lords oppress us. So we get the sense that they are being oppressed, right? Especially the young ones, referring to the suitors. And then he says, and surely the gods have locked away his homecoming. So we immediately switch to Odysseus as the center of attention here for Eumaeus. And then the ritual deference is really important because here it's Melanthius and Odysseus, and Melanthius doesn't care about Odysseus, and moreover, he sees Odysseus as in disguise, of course, as a beggar, so he's not going to acknowledge him as a hero, right? But nevertheless, Odysseus is outraged that Melanthius does not recognize his memory, much less treat him, despite his appearance, treat him properly. And so that's really interesting. I think an interesting example of how no matter what the circumstances are, the dominated group is expected to serve or to show deference to the dominant group, despite what he appears to be. So even though he's a down and out hero, he still requires deference. And let's see. All right. So now let's move to the Iliad. So in the Iliad, I think this is where we're in wartime. So war is a situation where race is created. This is in the violent sense. So if we go to the violent sense, right? And how you can recognize it is in how who gets enslaved, how the enslavement tends to happen, but also how bodies are treated in death. And so what's interesting about the Iliad is that it thematizes right from the start that the way the bodies are going to be treated in death is important. This is a crucial thing. So in this way, I'm already starting to think that the Iliad is making us worry about the racialization that happens in war, right? At least to heroes, right? Heroes becoming racialized, that's a problem. So here we have the fact that Achilles' wrath is going to make the bodies of the heroes lie out on the battlefield for the dogs and the birds to eat. And this is a horrible end. Now, in Justin's class, we were looking at some of the passages from the Iliad and Odyssey and Argonautica, and we're looking at this more to see what's Homeric, but I picked it also because of the fact that here it's Hector and Andromache, and Andromache's trying to get Hector not to get back into the battle, but she tells him about Achilles, how Achilles treated her family. He killed them all, right? But he didn't take away his father's armor, right? He didn't strip when he killed her father. He didn't strip him of his armor. And in fact, he buried him, gave him a decent burial, right? And so this is already forecasting an issue that's going to happen in the text, where Hector is going to strip the armor off of Patroclus, Achilles' armor off of Patroclus. And this, of course, is going to enrage Achilles when he sees this happening. And then, of course, then Achilles himself is going to desecrate Hector's body, right? Now, the other thing about it is that Achilles also doesn't enslave her mother, right? In fact, he hands her off, and she survives, right? So there's two things that Achilles does here that in the past that Andromache's pointing out as aspects of him that we don't really see in the Iliad. So that's kind of interesting. And so we were talking about the fact that how her speech is introduced as sort of delegitimized. It's epos, right? And not mutos. And so this, I think, is where we tend to find critical voices against the racialization and the domination in these deauthorized voices, right? So here, I think, is a place where she's pointing out what's normal, what's okay, and anything beyond that is moving into racialization, right? And so, of course, Achilles, of course, does this, and then the gods get angry. And I think part of the issue with Achilles is that he sees himself, again, just like Odysseus with the Cyclops. Achilles sees himself as superior to other heroes. He perceives himself to be, or keeps emphasizing the fact that he is a goddess's son. So perhaps he sees himself as a higher race than the other heroes, which doesn't make much sense, but he does. And so he has this attitude that will lend him to do this kind of thing. All right, so move to the Argonautica now. Another text that is, the Argonautica is a text that has the legacy of the Odyssey in it. And so what's interesting here is, again, the same issue with monsters and herders and how they're going to be racialized. So there's three instances where the Argonauts encounter herdsmen and or what could be herdsmen, and all of them are violent. And so the only three violent instances in the Argonautica are with herders, is the other way of looking at it. And so here you have, when they get to Cyzicus, there's this island that island of Cyzicus, where the Doliones have one half of the island and these Gegenes, monsters, have the other half of the island. And there's a lot of, in the text, there's a lot of allusions to the Lystragonians and to the Cyclopes all throughout this text. So you're supposed to imagine, oh, he's redoing the Lystragonian Cyclops episode here, because there's so many echoes of that text. But what's interesting is how he describes the folks, the Gegenes. They're earthborn, which automatically implies monsters that are attacking Zeus, right? They're wild agrioi, they're hubristai, so they're criminal or they're aggressive. And we're not giving any kind of genealogy for them other than that they're earthborn. And they live in the mountains, and which is like, in caves, presumably. So the idea they kind of live a herder lifestyle. Well, they're not explicitly called herders, but they pretty much look like that. And then on the other side, we're told that there are men, aneres, and the text is very clear that the Gegenes are not men, whereas the Doliones are. So they're men, and their leader is a king, and he's a hero. He's descended from God, all this kinds of stuff. And then what happens? Well, we're told to reinforce the idea these guys are monsters. And then this is part of a colonializing monstrification of indigenous folk. We are reminded about Heracles and his labors. Heracles is one of the guys on the boat. And we're told that these Gegenes are a labor sent by Hera for him. And then later on, we're told that this region is going to be colonized by Athenians, et cetera. So it is part of this whole settler colonialist narrative here. Okay, so they're monsters, and they've even got backing from Hera. And so when the Argonauts kill them, what's interesting here is how the bodies are treated. So when they're killed, their bodies are laid out like wood on the beach, heads in the water, feet on the sand, or vice versa. And notice the others, conversely, resting their heads on the sandy shore and their feet in the deep water. Both groups become prey for birds and fish instead of birds and dogs, birds and fish. Same idea, though, the desecration of the body for wild animals to eat. This is bad. Now, the Argonauts, of course, also wipe out the other indigenous folk, which is the Doliones, but the folk that they actually recognize as human. And so what do? They actually have a burial for the king. They treat him like a hero. They build up a mound for him. They do a dance, and they honor him with games. So they treat him with the due respect that you give another hero. So the double standard, we have one group who we've already monstrified, the narrator calls explicitly monsters, and they're just treated as if they're resources, whereas the others are treated with proper dignity that is accorded to a hero. So there you have that. Then we meet the actual herdsman, who, again, a lot of echoes of Cyclops coming in here. And he is actually a son of Poseidon, but with a nymph. So he's not really a hero. Heroes are the children of gods and heroines, right? So he's not really, he's not of the same race, we would say, genetically, in that sense. And he's a shepherd going out to check his sheep, and the Argonauts roll up in their ship, and he immediately is presented as very aggressive toward them. So we're already sort of not on board with him, because the Argonauts have been meeting friendly engagements up to this point, right? And then the first really hostile person is him. And so the reader is made to be already not on board with what he's about. And then, if in case we didn't quite catch it, that we're not supposed to like him, the narrator tells us that he was like the offspring of deadly Typhoeus. So he metaphorically is monstrified, and even of Earth herself. So Gegenes again, right? So he's being metaphorically monstrified, and he's being as one of the enemies of Zeus. And then, of course, Polyphemus is a son of Zeus, and he's then made into this, he's compared to the heavenly star and all these positive imagery. So again, we have the herder is being monstrified. Now, what's interesting then is after they kill him, after Polydeuces kills him, the Argonauts then have to kill his men, right? Because they're not going to let their king get killed. So they get into a fight with them, and the narrator has two sets of similes. One is to compare the Argonauts to gray wolves that attack countless sheep in their pens. So we get this anti-herder imagery associated with the Argonauts. They're the things that sheep and herders don't want to have anything to do with. And meanwhile, the others are the sheep. Now, the second simile is interesting because the narrator starts off directly comparing the Argonauts to shepherds, but then realizes this is not going to work. The simile situation can't work. I'm going to switch to beekeeping. So he moves to a different type of work that is associated in particular with the Ptolemaic dynasty at this point in time when Apollonius is writing, and it's a technological kind of work. And so he's switched off from saying, oh, they're not shepherds, I mean beekeepers, and then more civilized kind of workers that he's going to compare them to. And all right, so then that leads us to the question, where are the anti-racist voices in Epic, right? So this, let me, there's one I can identify, not in Epic, but in satire. We have Marshall, and he makes this statement, yesterday, Calidorus, you sold a slave for 1,200 sesterces just so you could dine well once. But you did not dine well. The 4-pound mullet you bought was the main dish, the showpiece of the meal. I want to shout out loud, this is not a fish, you wicked bastard. Oh, it's a human being. Calidorus, you're eating a human being. You're behaving like a Cyclops, one might say, right? You're a cannibal. But here you have this, in this deauthorized genre that is satire, you do have a recognition that you can't sell a human being, right? That, or you shouldn't sell a human being. But this is the state of a racialized body, right? Is that they're fungible, they can be transformed into separated from their family, sold to someone else. So here you have someone who's calling out this problem. Granted, it's in Marshall, so deauthorized, but nonetheless, it is a recognition that there's something really wrong with this whole process. And so if we're looking for these voices, then there's some likely suspects of a deauthorized, or sorry, anti-racist voices. If we're looking for them, what we're looking for is voices that confirm or affirm the humanity of the oppressed group, right? Granted, they might very well be part of the oppressed group, but nonetheless, they affirm the humanity. They recognize the trauma of the alienation of humanity. So we're looking for voices that do that, voices that condemn the cruelty and brutality of the oppressor or exploiter. Maybe harder to find in Epic. You can definitely find some of it in historiography of the slave revolts, particularly in Diodorus Siculus, but in general, not so much, maybe. Voices that empathize with the resistance of the oppressed or exploited group. So these are what we're going to be kind of looking for. And okay, let's go back to the Odyssey. We might have to have them ourselves. We have to listen to the Cyclops himself and wonder about, hey, you're eating my cheese, this kind of stuff. Maybe sort of think about it from the Cyclops point of view. Wait a second, these guys barged into my house, ate my sheep, and they poked my eye out and did all this stuff. That might be one. It's hard. It's really hard to do that given how the Cyclops is framed for us. And he himself is also aggressive, so it's difficult to penetrate a sympathetic vision of him there. But we might consider looking at how consider the question about Melanthius as switch do what my colleague calls racial parallax in the case of Melanthius, and think about, well, what if Melanthius, how can Melanthius actually be supportive of Odysseus without knowing that Odysseus is there, etc. isn't it unfair to expect him to support this beggar guy over Odysseus, etc.? And worry about Melanthius's position in that setup is one way of dealing with the herders in the Odyssey. But of course, the it does appear that there is some claim to justice that the Cyclops gets, right? Because both Zeus, Poseidon do make claims for him, right? That, hey, this was not okay, the way Odysseus treated the Cyclops. And the Cyclops curse does to a large extent come true. So we might see that, well, overarchingly, there is some kind of anti-racist tendency there, only a tendency. Now, back to the Argonautica, though, there's been more hope there, I feel. In the similes, there are very sympathetic pictures of poverty, of workers who are oppressed. So here's a simile, at the time when the gardener or plowman happily departs the field for his hut, yearning for his supper, and right there on the threshold, he bends his exhausted knees, caked in dust, and staring at his worn out hands, he heaps many curses on his belly. At that time, the Argonauts reached the village of the Chians around the Argonanthonian mountain at the mouth of the river Chius. So we're getting a picture. Every now and then we get these glimpses of what poverty is like, and it is very sympathetic. So there are these moments, but on the metaphorical level, we're getting that. And also there's a hostility toward Hercules in the Argonautica. One of the major aspects of the text is the way in which Hercules is not presented in a positive light compared to other stories involving Hercules. So when they meet the Argonauts meet him again after he departs in the first book. He shows up again in book 4 in the desert in Libya, and the Argonaut, after he has done his apples of the Hesperides labor. So the Argonauts show up the day after Heracles has accomplished that labor. And they come to the tree where the serpent has been killed. And the nymphs of the tree, the Hesperides themselves, they appear to the Argonauts and start complaining about Hercules. Now, and bearing in mind that these beings are like muses, right? They're goddesses. They turn around and say, yesterday a man came most destructive, looking in his violence and physique, and his eyes flashed from under his shaggy brow, pitiless. He wore a raw hide of a monstrous lion around his shoulders, and he had sturdy olive branches and a bow, which he shot arrows and killed this monster. And they're very sympathetic to their monster. They love the monster. But yeah, so you get this very hostile reading of what Heracles did to the monster. And of course, if we transmogrify monsters back to indigenous peoples, right, that are being wiped out so that colonization can take place, then there's this voice that's suggesting that this is not a good thing. And then the final one in the Argonautica is when they, so there's 3 cases of violent interaction with herders, and the third one is very strange in that it's sort of already framed that to let the herder off, where we're told that Canthus, the Argonaut, is fated to die. And we're told in the beginning, and now again reminded that he's fated to die. And so Canthus sees this herder coming and decides, well, everybody's hungry. Let me go and get this guy's sheep from him. Now, he could have said, hi, we're hungry. Could you give us some sheep? No, he decides to attack him to kill him for his sheep. And unlucky for him, this particular shepherd is actually a good fighter. And so the shepherd fights back and he kills Canthus. But then, of course, the Argonauts take revenge and kill him. And now what's interesting is not so much what the Argonauts do, because, of course, they just leave his body out there to die, and they don't really care about Caphareus, the herder. But the narrator has sort of changed his attitude to herders by now. And so he now gives him this sort of epitaph where he tells his genealogy, says that he is the grandson of the Corian Phoebus, and the chaste maiden Acacalis, whom Minos sent off. So he identifies him as a hero. And also what's interesting is that he gives his genealogy where it's connected to the peoples that are just outside adjacent to the Ptolemaic dynasty. So we're not characterizing those peoples that are nearby us, that are not in our sphere of interest, but they're not even our sphere, but they're just outside. We're not characterizing them as monstrous. We're characterizing them as sort of okay, maybe not quite, but yeah. So there's definitely a sort of way of looking at these North African peoples through Cepharius as people that could be heroic according to the narrator, despite what the Argonauts do. The Argonauts treat him as someone they don't care about. All right, and so amplifying. Well, this is just to end here, is to say, well, I think we have to take oppositional reading strategies in order to find these anti-racist voices. For the most part, they're not going to be readily available to us, given that the dominant structure of the societies that we're studying are colonial societies. They have slavery built in. They're engaged in conquering and conquest all the time. So the constant manufacture of race is going to be part of that. So it's going to be hard to find anti-racist voices on a direct, like Marshall level, where you see someone making a statement like that, or in Diodorus. But at the same time, it's not impossible. And I think a more oppositional reading strategy would be the way in which you can uncover them. But then, of course, this makes studying of the text very complex, which is what makes them so rich. Like we can come at the texts, looking at them as works of art, and therefore, with multiple perspectives, they can be opened up and deliver a better reading. So in other words, if we script up the script, like the texts have been used for the supporting of colonialist, imperialist, racist discourses. This is a given, right? Well, what I'm suggesting is that we consciously make the effort to have used the text in the opposite way, for basically using them for good. And it's not like the texts don't have within them the possibilities of these readings. If you pay attention a little bit more closely and be a bit more concerned about, why am I aligned with Achilles here? He's a bit problematic figure. Why am I aligned with Odysseus here? He's a problematic figure. These kinds of things might be a way of getting at it. Right, so that's where I'm gonna end. And I'll take questions. So I'll stop the sharing. And all right, so I'm willing to take questions. I can't hear you, Allardyce.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murray, for this really enlightening lecture. I'm Alex van der Motel. I'm the head of the Department of Classics, and I will sort of monitor the Q&A because Dr. Westerhold will soon have to leave for another engagement.
Oh,
so if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A. You can also type them into the chat because we have Dr. Collins Elliott, who is monitoring the chat. We have divided the duties here. So I have a first question here, and it says from an anonymous attendee, and it asks, do you think that hate through racism places more emphasis on the physical appearance or the stereotypes expected from race?
Well, I think that the hate is what you're trying to actually get at or to generate through racism. Like you want the individuals to hate the racialized group, because then that will maintain the difference between them, right? And so I don't necessarily think physical difference is necessary, as we see with the story that I told was precisely to break down this idea that physical difference would be necessary, right? But it does help, right? If you're made to think that black skin is somehow a sign of a monster, right? Then the fear that comes from seeing a monster is, especially if it's brought into you as a child. And that's another reason why I picked the Lillian Smith thing, because these narratives come in as children, right from the start. Like you're born into this universe, and people are telling you these stories. And so from authoritative sources, i.e. parents, church, these kinds of things. And so so I think hatred is actually the goal. It's the goal of racism. It's like to make people hate each other, right? And therefore go to war against each other, or keep these people in their place when it comes to work. They're supposed to do that kind of work, and that kind of thing. I think hatred is the goal on the individual level. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, with a transhistorical definition of race, such as the one you propose, critics might say, well, of course, everything will look like race with race-tinted glasses.
Mm-hmm.
How might we combat such a critique, and how should we present a transhistorical definition of race to students?
Okay, well, okay. Well, I think well, race tinted glasses might actually be what's necessary, actually, because there are these structures that are, and they are these structures in society that attend the way societies that have like domination built in, right? And most of our societies in the world, like it seems to be a universal thing of human societies, is that even when they claim their democracies, right, there is still this hierarchical thinking, and and the folks who have power at the top want to control that. They want to keep that power to themselves. And so recognizing that these processes are similar, right, actually I think helps to understand that this is not a unique moment, right? Like our version of race is not unique. This is part and parcel of how societies want to manage people, want to control, people that we need their labor here, and they're not going to give it to us free. So how are we going to get it from them, right? And how are we going? And it's not just like one person. You're going to get the whole society to keep that going, right? And so, yeah, how does that work? But I think definitely one of the things that we need to look at is the issue of alienated humanity, right? So this is different from class, right? Because people in the same race can be in different classes where they don't look at that other white person as not human, right? Or subhuman or inferior. They just see them as a poor white person, right? Whereas if it's whereas in the way race works with black and white, you're looking at the black person as someone who you're refusing to give humanity to, right? The police don't give humanity. The state does not recognize their humanity. And you see that on a regular basis being acted out, reenacted in the way they're treated. And so I think this is the thing you have to recognize, that, yeah, this particular version of racism that we have is quite successful. We can think about it as like a successful virus that is plaguing us. It's very successful. It's very deeply entrenched, but it's built upon genealogies of racism that came before they hit upon this, like, oh, this one works, right? Because another way I think about it is in the ancient world, there wasn't really the the impetus to worry about physical difference, because we wanted to enslave everybody possible, right? So if we say only Black people, then we're limiting to an only small group of people, right? Whereas if we say everybody can be enslaved because we can conquer everyone, we can take everybody's land, then we don't have to worry about it. Um, uh, the physical aspect is something that can be added in for good measure in the case of our situation, and it is historically generated, because when you think about at the time when we start developing phenotype, skin color based race, it's connected to, it's in dialogue with or contestation with arguments about, oh, humans should not be enslaved. It's coming out of a period of a dip in slavery in the Middle Ages, but then a new surge in slavery because of the discovery of the New World, right? And then the ideas about the Enlightenment, about everybody, humans being equal or whatever, all of this stuff is running a counter to the economic demands of the New World plantation colonial system, which wants slaves, right? So, well, what if we then say certain people are not human enough, or certain people? Let's actually tweak Aristotle's natural slavery argument to actually talk about physical difference, because Aristotle doesn't talk about physical difference because it didn't make sense to him. Like, we're conquering the world. We don't need to, but now we can tweak that to suit our particular purposes. So people, Black and brown people, depending on which colony, where you are in the colonial universe, they're inferior. They're better off enslaved, right? Because that's their natural state. So that argument develops in that period, right? But before that, there was no need to develop that argument. So I would agree. Yes, race tinted glasses indeed are probably necessary, because it'll explain a lot of what's going on. It explains why certain women, like in the Odyssey, again, you can think about, well, why is it that the women, Odysseus's women, the slave women, they end up being murdered after however long they've been systematically raped by the suitors, right? They end up being murdered. Whereas Penelope, the suitors don't even consider the possibility of raping her, right? And it's not like this didn't enter into anybody's mind, because in the Cyclops, the Euripides Cyclops, right, the issue of raping Helen comes up in that. So it's not like it's outside of the realm of possibility or thoughts of the readers, of the ancient readers. No, it's because Penelope is in the dominant race, and you cannot rape her without consequence, whereas you can with the slave women, right? There's no consequence. And you can think about it in terms of, how does Odysseus handle the death of the suitors? He can't just kill them. He has to pretend that something is going on, right? And then he has to sort of deal with the consequences of their parents coming and all that. Like, it's not possible for him to do that without having to deal with actual consequences, because they're heroes. Whereas he has no problem stringing up Melanthius. Nobody's questioning that. So I think this can only be explained, I think, by race. That these differences can only be explained that way.
By seeing yourself as being different from these other people.
Pardon?
By seeing yourself as being fundamentally different from others.
Absolutely, yeah. And withholding the ideas that the humanity from them.
That's
right. Not in and how that works in with the women. If Odysseus actually had humanity, or granted humanity to the women, right, he would have thought, well, okay, they were victims of the suitors. What are they supposed to do? Right? Are they supposed to, like, what can they do? There's nothing they could do. But he could have had some sort of mitigating circumstances in his thought patterns about that, right? But he doesn't, and that's because they're not, it doesn't matter what their experience is. It's irrelevant. It's the humiliation that the rape of these women impute to him as their owner. That is what matters, right? And so yeah, so it's interesting there, and I think we could think about it that way. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is by Kelly Dubin, and says, thank you. I think this work challenges the ongoing attitudes towards enslavement and racism, like, well, it's just the way it was, and everybody accepted it, and it was a different time. I try to bring ancient and other historical counter-narratives into the classroom to debunk those attitudes, and your talk has given me some new ideas. Do you have more suggestions for getting this work in the classroom?
Yeah, I think if we consider that ancient authors all recognize that freedom was a good thing, right? That they do recognize that nobody wanted to be enslaved, right? And people they were more aware of the possibility of themselves ending up in slavery due to the state being conquered, right, than say we are, right? And so I think that if we think about that, that even the folks like Cicero who have whole kinds of armies of slaves or whatever, that even someone like Cicero can talk about, granted he's using it in political terms, but he's talking about what slavery brings. Yeah, that everybody knows that this is not good. Like, and I think my next door neighbor who wrote the article on medical writers talks about how there's interesting how Galen is just talking about how, oh, these patients of his, they're slave owners, have arms that hurt. Why? Well, because they've been beating their slaves too much. Right? So there's a lot of violence built into the whole system, right? That it can't possibly be okay. Yeah, but again, it's there's also the veneer of, yeah, they wanted to think it was okay, like in the ancient world, just as the slave owners in antebellum Tennessee or Alabama wanted to believe that they were doing the right thing. So of course they have a discourse to cover that. The problem is when we buy into that, right? Like we don't recognize that that's actually the racecraft of the ancient world, right? That they are human beings. They feel guilty. They feel that being cruel to people is bad. They're not human. They have these feelings, but to assuage that, they have to tell a story about why that's okay, right? And so if we don't recognize that that's what's going on, yeah, sure, we can accept that whole narrative. Yeah, but it was the ancient times and they didn't think about it. Well, we can pick sections in antebellum USA and see that there were slave owners who were not comfortable, even though they were perfectly okay with having their slaves, but they were still felt queasy about it. Not everybody was just happy with it. A lot of people recognized that there was a problem. So yeah.
It's interesting how we get this hierarchical society and people are being exploited, and there's a whole narrative to justify that. And yet, there are always people who feel it is not right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I think
Some
so.
hope for humanity, I think.
Yeah, and you can see it in Aristotle. What's really interesting in Aristotle, you can see it because he's saying, well, there's some people who say that slavery is something that we invented, but with the law, but no, it's natural. So there's obviously people who are saying that this is something that we're manufacturing, but he's arguing no, it's natural, and he's going to create this natural argument, right? But there is the other argument. Right, that he's actually arguing against. If we think that he's just not speaking out there, pontificating with no other voice, like he's actually speaking to another argument that we don't get to hear, but that it's out there, that he knows is out there, right?
There's a question about, do you make any distinction between race and class? But you have explained that, I think. Another question by Marissa Krimpotic. Thank you so much. Maybe this is beyond the scope, but how would you read Virgil's much more positive view of herders when compared to Homer's?
Yeah, so I was paying attention to the time, so so I didn't go into the opposite side. So another source for anti-racist readings is if you accept that herders are being racialized, then would be the bucolic poetry. So with Theocritus and then Virgil, right? Theocritus in particular, because he is Sicilian and he's by that time they've already sort of located the Cyclops in Sicily. And so he, in Idyll 11, of course, says, oh, Nicias, who he's writing the poem to, our kinsman, the Cyclops, solved this problem of love, blah, blah, blah. So he is already try to demonstrify the Cyclops. And in that poem and the other one, the Cyclops is just a lumbering other, okay, fine, he's got one eye, but he's not so monstrous. He's sort of like, what's the green guy, the green monster? You know?
Oh, the Hulk.
Shrek.
Oh.
Shrek. That's Shrek.
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 Yes.
He's like Shrek, right? So we made him into a kind of more appealing, sort of more humanized. We give him a love affair. We have him have feelings, and not just for his sheep, but also for actual person. So you see that in already in Theocritus, and then Virgil too. And Virgil there, I think even Virgil is even more speaking from their perspective, because he's talking about the loss of their land and all this stuff about what it's like to be enslaved, and all very sympathetic terms. But what's really super interesting is how he represents the imagery of shepherds in the Aeneid, because again, we're back in the heroic universe, right? And shepherds are supposed to be bad in the heroic world, and he aligns Aeneas with shepherds. I was shocked. He compared, because it's not, Apollonius, as I showed you, does not want to connect the shepherds with the heroes, but Virgil does. Virgil compares Aeneas to a shepherd when he's attacking the city, and moreover, a shepherd with weapons, which for Roman mindset, that's slave rebellion type language, right? So there's something about this. So there's definitely an undercutting of Aeneas Augustus thing. Richard Thomas really likes this idea of the hostile reading of the Aeneid. Yeah, and indeed, you get this hostile reading if you look at how he's connected to shepherds. Yeah, he's being presented, especially in those scenes where he's an armed shepherd. He's being, in the Roman mindset, as far as I can see, being connected to the Sicilian servile shepherds who were in rebellion. And there's this great quote from Cicero where he's in the Verrines, where he's talking about how Verres doesn't do things the way the old guys did it, and he has some shepherds running around with him. And he says, well, back in the day, there was this one governor of the island who, when there was a boar rampaging through the countryside and everybody was trying to get it, so it sounds like a heroic story, Caledonian boar hunt, and they get the boar, and this shepherd kills the boar, saves the town. They call him into the governor, and what does the governor do? Crucifies him. Why? Because he shouldn't have weapons, because he's a shepherd. Right? So there's definitely this so if this is the mindset that shepherds are not people that should have weapons, then you have Aeneas being compared to a shepherd with weapons. There's something going on that's really undermining the heroic status of Aeneas / Augustus / Caesar, whatever, that whole narrative there, and siding with the shepherd side to a certain extent. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, we have a lot more questions, but we only have time for one more, I'm afraid. So, but we save this chat and we'll send them to you, so that if you want, you could.
Yeah, that'll be good. If people want to.
This is from Justin Arft. Jackie, thanks so much for your visit to class today. And this is really a great lecture. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Do the authorized voices ever have a positive effect? Or does the focalization to women, slaves, or monsters take all the power out of the critique?
Well, I think it depends on, it would depend on the receiving audience and the time, but we might look at, say, tragedy as a receiver of the epic, right? And there you do see tragedy taking the side of the women, like especially the suppliant women, etc. And the what's the other one? The Trojan women. You see so tragedy is a vehicle, it seems, where you can see the way epic is transformed, the epic construction is transformed with a different focalization. The Argonautica is already receiving it different, and bucolic is already receiving it differently, right? So if you look at how, say, if the Odyssey is this way, and then look at the texts that are receiving it, how they do. In the case of the Cyclops, Euripides' Cyclops, it's a reaffirming of that view, only that the argument is that, well, we should not be treated like the slaves. Is the art that how that works out is that, yes, the Cyclops is he makes the Cyclops a hero. Euripides makes him on the hero side, and so Odysseus is saying, you're like me, we are Greeks, you shouldn't treat us like this, right? So there's no problem of, you could treat other people like that, sure, but just you can't treat us like this because we're Greeks, right? So that's another way it's received, where they're complaining about how they're being treated, but they're okay with the general structure of people being enslaved and treated badly. But as long as it's not them, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Very interesting. I'm afraid that we have to cut off the Q&A. We're only about halfway, really. But it's, we're already half an hour over time. So please help me to thank Dr. Murray for this really great lecture. It was very trenchant analysis of how oppression works and how it's internalized, how the narrative is constructed, and then is so pervasive and so internalized. And you have given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much for visiting us and for your wonderful lecture. And
well, thank you all so much for inviting me, and it was a lot of fun.
It was very interesting. Thank you all for coming, for attending. And
thank you, everybody. Evening. I can't see you, but thanks.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.